But today, India's problems come largely from the Chinese power, whether it's in Kashmir, whether it is on terrorism, whether it is on Pakistan. So I think we are now seeming to break out of that spell.
So this week in Raja Mandala, your column for the Indian Express, you take an interesting angle, using the 100-year anniversary of the Communist Party of China, of the CCP, to look at India and China and foreign policy and the interplay between national interest and internationalism, and how, in some ways, I'd say you're saying that China has maneuvered better the international environment for its national interest. So one of the things that's interesting, when you talk about the initial glory, Panchsheel and all of that, India sort of desire to create a united front. That flexibility, traditionally the understanding has been that up to, say, Nehru and the China war, despite non-alignment, despite this thing, India had kept all its doors open. We weren't completely committed to the Soviet camp in the way that we are now. Non-alignment, in some ways, for that time, gave us that maneuver. Do you think that actually the Chinese aggression affected Indian foreign policy, and that flexibility, it pushed us towards the Soviet Union, and then subsequently that kind of ideological entrenchment came in? Or does it predate the China-India fight?
Well, I think as far as China is concerned, I think there is a longer history of, sentimentalism, of idealism, and that we are somehow Asian brothers, we're going to work together. And that's why, I start with Tagore, who goes to China in 1924, talks about spiritual civilization. Chinese want modernization, westernization. Then you have Nehru in 1927 talking about working together, but they can't do it in the Second World War because China is fighting Japan and India is fighting the British. So I think so there's been this, either the notion of solidarity with China, and in fact, even I didn't mention it in the column, but in the interwar period, when China was occupied by Japan, the Indian National Congress used to do regular protests against Japan in the Indian cities. So I think there was a long tradition, one of the sense of Asian unity, Asian solidarity, that India must work with China to change the world. So that theme has run through for a long time. And that the 62 did not seem to change that completely, because back in, once we come to the 1990s, India is again joining hands with China and saying West is the problem, therefore let's work with China. But today, India's problems come largely from the Chinese power, whether it's in Kashmir, whether it is on terrorism, whether it is on Pakistan. So I think we are now seeming to break out of that spell. We've called out the Belt and Road Initiative. We've joined the Quad in spite of the Chinese objections. So I think it's been long in the making, this idea, somehow we are obliged to work with China, and that we should not do anything that will hurt China. Because when China was being isolated by America in the 50s, Nehru said, no, China must be brought into the Security Council. They must be given their rightful place in the international system. And then when there was this report about India being offered the Security Council seat in spite of China, we said, no, it must go to China. So I think there is a long record of this romantic notion of China. And I think that has created special problems, I think, for India's engagement with China and the world.
One of the things, which is a well-known thing you mentioned, that phase of Chinese diplomacy during Deng Xiaoping's time, which was part of it was, of course, engagement with the West, sort of domestically a compromise with capitalism, let's say, or capitalism with Chinese characteristics, from socialism with Chinese characteristics. But one of the things was that be quiet, do not show your full strength. That was the big, which is the change we see with Xi now. Do you think that India, there is even a lesson to be learned from that? Because more recently we get the sense that India, it is something, maybe this is detractors of the Indian foreign policy establishment of the current government even may argue that now it looks like that you're doing the opposite of what Deng did. You're exaggerating your capabilities in a way that maybe, rather than biding your time and doing the quiet work that's necessary both in terms of the domestic economy as well as internationally, that there is a tendency to, in fact, rather than learn that lesson from China from that phase, that we're sort of trying to punch above our weight. And if that is, how do you see that that phase of Chinese diplomacy, if there's anything for India to learn?
No, there is the occasional rhetoric about talking about India's great role in the world, but I think that we've been rather cautious. For example, the Americans have been reaching out to India for a long time. We've been hesitant to, fully engage with them till the last 3 years. We are in the Quad, but it is still work in progress. So it is barring the ideologues' rhetoric. But if you look at policy, the policy has been quite careful until, I would say, the developments in Doklam, when India started reviving the Quad. And now in the last 1 year, because of the developments in Ladakh, now India has moved closer to the first serious meetings of the Quad have taken place. So I think what we've seen happen is really not India claiming a larger role than necessary. It's actually being pushed by China into doing things with the Americans, which it would not do. For example, take the so-called Lemova agreement. This basically does, when an American ship is passing by, it can pick up fuel from Mumbai, or when India is in the Mediterranean, it can pick up, something from the American bases there. A fairly simple accounting agreement, but it took us 15 years to negotiate that agreement, starting somewhere in 2004, well into 2016, 17. That's when we signed it. So I think there was this hesitation of somehow there is an ideological line that prevents us from doing things with the Americans. And I think it is that self-imposed red line, which I think delayed a lot of engagement with the Americans, even when things opened up between us. So I would say it's really, we're a long way. I think today, as I said, look, we are 5 times smaller than China when it comes to economy, 3 times smaller than the military capacities. So I don't think India is now, it needs now, like what China did. China was the weak party. It was racked by civil war, but yet its importance was enough for it to align with US against Russia in the 1960s. And that made a big difference to the Asian balance of power, that helped divide the communist parties in Asia, that put Russia on the defensive. So there are things that you can do, but we've not been willing to do things with the US. I think that has changed in the last 2-3 years. So I think our problem is still thinking strategically, and that when you're faced with a bigger power, you will need building coalitions. You need to balancing efforts that need to be strengthened. Because in the past, we thought ourselves as equal to China. Therefore, we can solve our problems on our own, and we don't need to do any balancing. But today, I think that policy has changed quite a bit.
Now, a convoluted question, this might be what I'm asking. Taking off from what you said in a larger sense, because it's the 100-year anniversary of the CCP, there is a sense, even from your piece I got, that there is a confidence with which, and I don't mean confidence in terms of a sort of bravado, but a confidence with which from the beginning, like you're saying, first with the Russians and with the Chinese, that the Chinese Communist Party and the state by extension has been able to act. So even when it came to, so it's the Chinese Communist Party, not the Communist Party of China. It sounds like a small semantic thing, that one, from the beginning, whether as communists, they were setting their own agenda with exactly what you're saying, national interest. So international policy, but the Comintern was not dictating, nor was the Soviet Union. And when they tried to, the Chinese sort of split with the Soviet Union, or more or less. Do you think that there has been some kind of, I think, the romanticism in India has come to some sort of ideological lack of clarity about where you want to go as a nation state? Do you think that kind of thing in the long term, in a sort of larger arc of history, not in the immediate term, plays a role in how we see the world and ourselves?
No, I think both at the level of the state as well as at the level of the communist parties. For example, I mentioned that, look, when Chinese were, coming up with crazy theories about the 3 world theory, about, Soviet social imperialism, they were for a realist analysis, they were patently Chinese national interest to oppose the Soviet Union. Yeah. But yet in India, we took those, on the left, took those theories as some kind of great formulations and used that to quarrel with each other. Because the CPIM broke from CPI because there was this thing between China and Russia. And then you have CPIML break from CPIM. So we've seen this, that the Indian left was unwilling to formulate its own, theory, and was constantly trapped into this of saying, look, is China right or Russia right? And then we got into so much of that argument. And then into dividing ourselves, the progressive movements in the country, so that they've been so enormously weakened. So I think that was part of a general problem that India took many of these internationalist principles literally, rather than viewing through the prism of statecraft, of realism, of how states use ideology to pursue their own interests. At the level of the governments, for example, I mean, I think the problem was that the belief that, look, Asian solidarity, non-alignment or strategic autonomy impose certain limits on what we should do with the Americans. But China had no problem moving towards the Americans and when they wanted to. And today they're moving back closer to the Russians when it suits them. But yet in India, we made policy a prisoner to slogans, while China was creative enough to invent new slogans to suit its current policy requirements. As Mao Zedong himself said, leaning on one side. So he leaned on the Soviets when he wanted, leaned on the Americans when he wanted. When Deng Xiaoping talked about the three world theory and about both US and Russia problems, but actually in policy, they were actually fighting the Russians. But our intelligentsia, I think, was both at the level of the government as well as in the left movement, was unwilling to look at these issues, if I may use the word cynically, and in a realist prism, rather than taking them to be some kind of high doctrine coming from the high priests of the communist revolutions in China and Russia. And I think as a collective, I think we paid a big price for that because the communists had more access to China and Russia. But yet they were far more influenced by these debates rather than saying, look, guys, we need our own thing. We're not going to let them to dictate terms for India. So I think there has been this intellectual defensiveness and the sense that somehow we're obliged to defend China against the West. And that, I think, created all kinds of complications. But I think that was you would have thought 62 would have taught us a lesson. Yeah. But there, back in 90s, we were talking about multipolarity. And when we were defining American power was a bigger problem than Chinese power. Now today, India is squeezed by the Chinese all around. So I think that we need to take theories that come from governments with a pinch of salt, rather than thinking just because they come from revolutionary states, somehow they're a gospel that needs to be followed.
Yes, sir. So one final question now, sort of taking off of it. Now, like you put, the current phase of Chinese diplomacy, as you put it in the 4 phases in the article, everyone should read it. It will be, the link should be in this description on the IndianExpress.com, in the opinion section as well as the homepage. So you talk in the current phase where now you have as assertive a China as we've ever seen. There's no hiding. They're trying to build Xi Jinping is looking at a new global economic as well as strategic order, international order with China at its center. That seems to be the sense. How do you think at this stage now India is finally getting over these sort of ideological chains, if want of a better word, to be able to maneuver? Because it will require a high degree of maneuverability, perhaps greater than what China had to do between the Soviet Union and the Soviet. Do you think that we have the kind of diplomatic thinking and agility to manage that?
I think it's going to be a huge challenge. I mean, it's not just for one government, but I think it's going to be a multi-generational challenge for India. How does it deal with Chinese power? And India never had a great power on its neighborhood. While China had to deal with the Americans sitting in Japan, in Taiwan, in South Korea, they've had a long experience of negotiating, fighting, collaborating, contesting, and undermining the US. But we never had to deal with a great power on our neighborhood. And today we have one, and which is, as I said, 5 times bigger than us economically. And its influence is growing by the day. So this requires new templates, I think, that will have nothing in common with the past. Therefore, I think we are going to be tested quite severely, our economic policy. Look, how do we build our national capabilities? Can we do a China now on the economic front? Or the system is no longer as favorable to globalization when China globalized? Then what are the economic choices? What are the terms on which we collaborate with the Americans? Because it's not that Americans are there just to save us. Their interest and our interest might converge for a moment. So what are the terms on which we collaborate with them? How do we build a regional coalition? So each one of this is going to be a huge problem. And in foreign policy, look, we're not the only actors. There are other sovereign players who are going to calculate their own things. So I think this requires a degree of flexibility and of adaptation, of a nimbleness that in the past we've not had. Sometimes we moved very quickly. For example, when things began to move, when Nehru turned to the US, when we had a problem with China in 1962. But I think as a sustained basis, we tend to be too conservative in assessing the world, as well as to be able to prepare our responses. Because even if foreign office guys are genius, how do you mobilize the rest of the system? I think that's where the Chinese have scored. The capacity to mobilize their commerce ministry, the full set of actors. Today, the universities are in the top in Asia. While Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution destroyed Chinese universities. At one point, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, and Delhi, these were big universities, Allahabad. But today, where are we? So I think this China question is not just a question of, combinations and permutations with other powers. It's also about building our own capabilities. I think this requires a far more focused effort in transforming our internal capabilities, of limiting internal conflict, and of creating policies that generate national strength and national capabilities. And I think this is going to be a huge challenge for us in the days ahead. And this time, there's no room for indiscipline because you have such a strong power on your doorstep, both in the Himalayas as well as in the waters of Indian Ocean below.
Great, sir. Thanks a lot. A lot to think about. I hope the powers that be watch this one and read your piece this time. Thanks so much, sir. We will see you next week.